Marvin looked Steve McQueen dead in the eye and said, "You'll never be a real warrior, kid. Just another pretty boy playing tough." What happened next in that MGM soundstage would become Hollywood's most violent and most covered-up brawl, involving broken equipment, spilled blood, and two legends discovering that some insults can only be answered with fists. The studio buried the story, but witnesses never forgot the night Hollywood's toughest actors proved their reputations weren't just for cameras. The sound of breaking glass suddenly meant more than movie magic. If you respect the real Steve McQueen, subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy, October 1967. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios, Culver City, California. Soundstage 15, where the elaborate interior sets for multiple war films were constructed under controlled conditions that eliminated actual danger while preserving authentic military atmosphere. The air carried the scent of sawdust mixed with prop gunpowder and the kind of masculine tension that came when method actors spent months preparing for roles that demanded psychological transformation into soldiers, fighters, and killers. This wasn't just any soundstage. This was where Hollywood's toughest actors came to test whether their screen personas could survive contact with actors whose toughness had been forged through actual combat experience rather than drama school exercises and stunt choreography. Lee Marvin, 43 years old, sat cleaning his prop rifle with movements that carried the mechanical precision of someone who'd performed identical maintenance on weapons that could actually kill people. Fresh from the Dirty Dozen's massive success, he occupied the soundstage like a general who'd earned his authority through proven capability rather than studio publicity campaigns. His weathered face showed scars from Pacific Theater combat that no makeup artist had applied, and his hands moved with the efficient competence of someone who understood violence as reality rather than entertainment. Steve McQueen, 37 years old, stood near the craft services table with the restless energy that characterized his approach to everything involving competition, hierarchy, or the relationship between reputation and authentic capability. His pale blue eyes missed nothing as he studied Marvin's routine, understanding that he was observing someone whose approach to war movie preparation went beyond professional requirements to reach territory where acting became remembering rather than pretending. The tension between them had been building for weeks as both actors worked on separate projects that shared the same soundstage facilities. Marvin's presence carried the weight of actual combat experience that made other actors' military roles look like elaborate dress-up games. McQueen's presence carried the energy of someone who'd learned toughness through civilian circumstances that were no less authentic for being different from military service. Both men understood that their encounter was about more than professional courtesy between colleagues. This was about fundamental questions regarding what qualified someone to portray warriors, heroes, and men who faced death for causes larger than personal advancement or artistic achievement. "McQueen," Marvin called out, his voice carrying the same commanding projection that had made him famous before he'd learned to modulate it for indoor conversations. "You're working on another one of those rebel without a cause pictures?" "Different kind of rebel, Lee. The kind who has plenty of causes worth fighting for." "Such as?" "Such as proving that toughness comes in different forms that serve different purposes for different kinds of men, facing different kinds of challenges." Marvin set down his rifle with movements that somehow made the gesture look more threatening than if he'd raised it in preparation for conflict. "Steve, can I tell you something about toughness that might save you some embarrassment down the road?" "Go ahead." "Real toughness gets tested under conditions where failure means permanent consequences. Real warriors get forged through encounters with actual enemies who want to kill them for reasons that have nothing to do with cameras or audience entertainment." "And you think that makes combat veterans the only people qualified to play tough characters?" "I think it makes combat veterans the only people who understand what authentic toughness actually costs when it's required for survival rather than performance." McQueen walked closer, his movement creating subtle shift in the dynamic between them that suggested something was about to change in ways that diplomatic conversation might not adequately address. "Lee, are you suggesting that my approach to tough characters lacks authenticity because I haven't killed anyone in organized warfare?" "I'm suggesting that there's a difference between learning to look dangerous for cameras and learning to be dangerous when cameras aren't rolling and lives depend on being more dangerous than whoever's trying to kill you. Different kinds of danger for different kinds of situations?" Different definitions of what authentic means when applied to men who claim to represent warriors, soldiers, and fighters whose real-life counterparts died proving their capabilities rather than just demonstrating them. The soundstage had grown quiet around them as crew members sensed that routine conversation was developing into something that transcended professional discussion to reach territory where personal reputations and fundamental philosophies about authenticity were being examined through direct confrontation. Lee, McQueen said, his voice carrying none of the theatrical projection that most actors automatically applied to group settings, "Let me ask you something about your understanding of what qualifies someone to represent toughness on screen. Ask away. Do you think audiences can tell the difference between actors who've experienced real violence and actors who've learned to simulate violence convincingly?" Marvin considered the question with the seriousness he applied to all discussions about the craft that had made him wealthy and respected, while serving purposes that went beyond entertainment to reach something like public education about what warfare actually required from people who survived it. "I think audiences respond to authenticity even when they can't articulate what makes one performance more convincing than another. Combat experience gives actors access to psychological territory that can't be reached through imagination or research alone." And you think that psychological territory is necessary for creating believable tough characters? I think it's necessary for creating tough characters who honor the memory of real tough men, rather than just exploiting their sacrifices for entertainment purposes. Interesting perspective. But Lee, let me suggest something about authentic toughness that your combat experience might not have taught you. Such as? McQueen's transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. The casual conversation partner became something that looked like it belonged in actual confrontations, rather than Hollywood discussions about confrontations. His posture shifted, his eyes focused, and his voice dropped to levels that required closer attention, rather than commanding it through volume. Such as the fact that some people learned to handle violence through circumstances that had nothing to do with patriotic duty or organized military structure. Some people learned to fight because the alternative was getting destroyed by people who enjoyed destroying anyone who couldn't fight back. Different kinds of violence for different kinds of purposes, different kinds of necessity creating different kinds of capability. Your violence served your country and honored principles worth dying for. My violence served survival in situations where principles were luxury I couldn't afford. Marvin studied McQueen with expression that mixed professional interest with something that looked like competitive analysis, understanding that the younger actor was describing background that went beyond typical Hollywood tough guy mythology to reach territory that might actually compete with military experience in terms of authentic preparation for violent roles. Steve, are you claiming that civilian violence produces the same kind of authenticity as combat experience? I'm claiming that violence is violence, regardless of whether it's organized by governments or forced on people by circumstances beyond their control. The psychological impact is the same, the survival skills are the same, the understanding of what it takes to hurt someone before they hurt you is exactly the same. But the purpose is different. Combat serves causes larger than personal survival. Street fighting serves nothing but personal interests. Maybe? Or maybe both serve the fundamental human requirement to survive encounters with people who want to eliminate you, and the specific cause matters less than the basic capability to win when losing means permanent failure. The distinction hung in the air like gun smoke, revealing fundamental differences in philosophy about violence, authenticity, and the relationship between military service and civilian toughness that couldn't be resolved through conversation alone. "Steve," Marvin said, his tone carrying new edge that suggested diplomatic discussion was approaching its natural conclusion, "you really think your street fighting background gives you the same understanding of violence that combat veterans carry?" "I think it gives me understanding of violence that serves the same dramatic purposes when applied to characters who need to convince audiences they could handle situations where technique matters less than commitment and rules matter less than results." Different tools for the same professional requirements? Different sources of the same authentic capability to portray men who've learned that survival sometimes requires doing things that peaceful people never have to consider. Marvin stood up with movements that carried none of the casual friendliness that had characterized the beginning of their conversation. This was someone preparing for something that might require physical rather than verbal resolution. Steve, let me tell you something about authentic violence that your reform school experience might not have taught you. Go ahead. Real warriors don't need to convince anyone they're dangerous. Their capability speaks for itself when circumstances require demonstration rather than discussion. And you think I need to convince people I'm dangerous? I think you need to prove it, because talking about toughness and being tough are completely different things, and audiences can sense the difference even when they can't explain what they're sensing. McQueen smiled with expression that carried no humor and considerable menace. Lee, are you challenging me to prove my toughness through some kind of demonstration? I'm suggesting that you'll never be a real warrior, kid. Just another pretty boy playing tough for cameras that won't be rolling when actual toughness gets tested. The insult landed like physical blow, designed to provoke response that would either validate Marvin's assessment or prove it wrong through methods that transcended verbal argument. McQueen understood that he'd been challenged according to standards that could only be met through action rather than explanation. Lee, that's the kind of statement that requires backing up with something more substantial than military service that ended 20 years ago. And you think you're capable of providing that backing? I know I am. What happened next transformed Soundstage conversation into something that belonged in actual combat zones rather than entertainment facilities. McQueen moved with speed that challenged Marvin's ability to process the transition from talking to fighting, closing distance before the older actor could prepare for physical confrontation that had escalated beyond diplomatic resolution. The first punch landed before Marvin could block or counter, catching him across the jaw with force that sent him stumbling backward into equipment racks that collapsed under impact, scattering prop weapons and lighting gear across the soundstage floor with crashes that brought crew members running from adjacent sets. But Marvin's military training kicked in with reflexes that had been honed through encounters with enemies who fought to kill rather than just win. He recovered balance, absorbed the impact, and responded with combination of punches that drove McQueen backward toward craft services tables that weren't designed to withstand the force of bodies hitting them at speed. The fight that followed wasn't choreographed or controlled. This was desperate, violent, and absolutely real combat between two men who'd been challenged according to standards that could only be satisfied through physical proof of capability rather than verbal claims about experience or training. McQueen's speed served him well in close quarters, where his motorcycle racing reflexes and reform school survival skills translated into ability to avoid damage while delivering punishment. But Marvin's size and military hand-to-hand training gave him advantages in strength and technique that made every successful hit potentially fight-ending. Equipment scattered across the floor as both men used whatever was available to gain advantage. Chairs became weapons, tables became shields, and the carefully constructed military set became battlefield, where two different approaches to authentic toughness tested themselves against each other through violence that served no purpose except settling questions that couldn't be resolved through conversation. Blood appeared on both men's faces as punches found targets despite defensive efforts that would have impressed professional fighters. McQueen's knuckles split against Marvin's jaw. Marvin's nose streamed from impact with McQueen's elbow. Neither man showed any indication of backing down or accepting defeat through submission rather than unconsciousness. The sound of breaking equipment brought studio security running, but they stopped at the soundstage entrance when they realized what they were witnessing. This wasn't typical Hollywood temperament or ego clash. This was authentic violence between authentic tough men whose reputations were being tested through methods that no insurance policy covered and no publicity department could manage. "Break it up," security finally intervened when both men showed signs of exhaustion that suggested the fight might continue until someone suffered permanent injury. "Studio property is getting destroyed." McQueen and Marvin separated reluctantly, both breathing hard, both bleeding, both understanding that they'd learned something about each other that couldn't have been discovered through any amount of conversation or professional observation. "This never happened," the head of security announced, understanding that publicity surrounding actual violence between major stars would damage both their careers and the studio's reputation. "Nobody saw anything. Equipment got damaged during stunt rehearsal. Medical will treat any injuries as training accidents. McQueen wiped blood from his split lip with expression that mixed satisfaction, with respect for someone who'd proven capable of backing up claims about toughness through performance, rather than just reputation. "Lee," McQueen said, extending his hand toward Marvin with gesture that acknowledged the older actor's capability, "you fight like someone who learned the hard way." "Steve," Marvin replied, accepting the handshake with grip that confirmed mutual respect earned through violence rather than granted through courtesy, "you fight like someone who never learned to quit." Different kinds of training for the same fundamental capability? Different sources of the same authentic toughness that serves characters who need to convince audiences they could handle real violence when circumstances demanded it. The cleanup took hours, with crew members sworn to secrecy about what they'd witnessed, and replacement equipment brought in to restore the soundstage to working condition. Both actors required medical attention that was documented as training injuries rather than fight damage, protecting their insurance coverage and employment status. Years later, when film historians analyzed the performances both men delivered in subsequent war films, they noted that something had changed in their approach to violent characters. Both carried themselves with confidence that went beyond acting technique to reach territory where screen presence was supported by personal experience with authentic conflict resolution. The fight had settled questions about authenticity, capability, and the different ways men could earn the right to represent warriors on screen. Neither man had won in any conventional sense, but both had proven that their toughness was real rather than manufactured, and that knowledge influenced every future performance where audiences needed to believe they were watching someone who could handle actual danger, rather than just simulating it convincingly. MGM's official records show no incident on Soundstage 15 during October 1967, but crew members who witnessed the confrontation remembered it as the most authentic violence they'd ever seen between actors whose reputations were built on portraying violent men. The broken equipment was replaced, the blood was cleaned up, and both men returned to work the following day with mutual respect that would influence their relationship for the remainder of their careers. They'd tested their authentic toughness against each other and discovered that different sources of violence could produce equally valid preparation for roles that required understanding of what it actually felt like to hurt someone who was trying to hurt you. Subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy for stories they never told you.